Welcome to the latest of our International Legitimacy talks as part of our International Legitimacy seminar series. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Eva Erman from Stockholm University. Professor Erman, welcome to Edinburgh.
Thank you.
I just wanted to open by asking you to talk a little bit about your general approach to legitimacy. I mean, we're talking about legitimacy in the international context, but what is maybe characteristic of your approach, would you say?
I think since I come from a political science background, but yet to political philosophy, from the background, political legitimacy in political science literature and in the more empirically oriented political theory focuses a lot on output, like in the exercise of power. So we want more accountability, we want more transparency, and so on. And the philosophical role also is the critical role discussing normative sources. Where do we get the normative ammunition, the normative sources saying that this is legitimate? Because we're talking about normative notions of legitimacy, which is not the sociological notions that some people also work on. That tells you what people actually think is legitimate. But I think the more moral or normative part is very important. So I've always been interested in the relationship between the input side and the output side. I don't usually use these terms, but they're commonly used in the political science literature. And by that I mean that we need to knit the authorization side in the exercise of power with the output side, the exercise of power. And I think for me it's very important that an account of political legitimacy must capture both aspects. But I see that in a lot of an empirically oriented theory, it's a bit of a divorce, like especially in the global governance context, because we think that, well, the most we can hope for in global governance is some kind of accountability or transparency. But I think that a problem with that is that, well, it depends what our feasibility concerns are. Are we dealing with something we want to realize tomorrow? Maybe that's a good view. But if we are more ideal and utopian in our thinking and want to have a more long-term goal, it might be good to get into these more deeper philosophical foundations, I think. And it's good not to lose that part of the discussion.
And what kind of particular challenges to political legitimacy exist, do you think, at the international level? Because often we talk about legitimacy in the state and we have our own ideas about it. What is it, in your view, that's salient about international politics, about international structures, about international law that presents its own challenges to legitimacy in the sense of input and output?
Yeah, I mean, of course, nation-state sovereignty, I would say, would be the key. But on the other hand, it's quite complex because if we look at empirical work on international organizations, for instance, those organizations that open up for like transnational actors like NGOs and so on, social movements, are often democratic states, where organizations are based on a democratic state. So I think the democratic state is an extremely important agent in increasing political legitimacy of global governance. So I don't want to throw the state out. I think it's one of the key. And then, of course, we have the problem with non-democratic states, since they're illegitimate from the start in a way. But this is also because I connect political legitimacy to democracy. Not all people do that. I think that democracy is the key source of legitimacy. But one can have other views on that, and I think that's contested. But for me, coming from the background of democratic theory, I think it's valuable to not disconnect political legitimacy from democracy.
But so then what are the kind of specific challenges that international organizations are faced with when we think in terms of democratic legitimacy?
Well, again, in political philosophy, we talk about ideal and non-ideal theory, what we think our theories are supposed to achieve. So if we want to achieve something right here under current conditions, I would say one of the challenges is more to democratize non-democratic states, even if we want a global democracy in the end, as an end state with some utopian. I think that's an underestimated area. I think a lot of the global governance literature, the normative theory literature, focusing a lot of all kinds of actors that contribute, but they focus very little on the problem of non-democratic states. It's kind of avoiding that problem. I think that could be discussed more. I think that's the key. Again, because I think democratic states has a very important role to play, even if we end up dissolving all of those in utopia, so to speak.
So in a sense, if we want a project of global democracy, we should start by democratizing the states that exist?
Well, just if you do non-ideal theory. I'm not doing that, but I think that's an important step.
Yeah.
I don't mind thinking more out in space. Depends on what you, I mean, that's what I've done, but I think it's important to distinguish. Because it's often you hear when people talk about more global democracy and more utopian ideas or ideals, I think it's easy to say, just dismiss them at the start. Well, it's unrealistic. But very few who say that say anything about the feasibility constraints or the kind of feasibility considerations they have tied to their own accounts, which is allegedly more realistic. So I think it's this is discussed a lot in justice theory, in philosophy, but very little in democratic theory. And I think that's bad, because then you dismiss some proposals for being idealistic, but on the wrong grounds. And you also have a very status quo biased non-ideal theory, where you just say, well, this is what we can achieve within the time frame that we're looking at. And I guess that's also because politics is short-term in a way.
Especially democratic politics.
Yeah.
Okay. In your paper today and in some of your work, you've talked about the role of civil society actors in international legitimacy. Could you tell us just a little bit about what you mean by civil society actors, with perhaps some examples and an outline of what role they can play in legitimating global governance? I understand that's basically your whole paper, but if you could give us a summary of, what you understand civil society actors to be, with some examples on what role they can play in enhancing the legitimacy of global governance institutions.
I mean, I have a very simple view of civil society because I'm not a civil society scholar. So, and also because I do this kind of broad strokes theorizing. That's what I'm doing. But I think that I see civil society basically as organizations, actors, social movements that are not the state and are not tied to the market or economic agents. So they're more like in between. And I think this is a fairly classical view. So I don't have any, and I think that and I think this is important, I think that what I'm trying to do is kind of neutral vis-a-vis different views of civil society. I think because it's such a broad project that I'm sketching here. So I think, and I hope it's applicable. The criticism I direct against some views are quite neutral vis-a-vis different views. But I think for me it's also important, since I work in political philosophy, we often start with criticism. So we're kind of negative even. So I think I come from the background of Jürgen Habermas' theory of democracy and law, which has been my inspiration a lot. And there we talk a lot about the public space or the public sphere. But I think that my criticism against a lot of civil society work, that it started with something like, well, Habermas talk about two-track view of democracy. We have a formal track with law and policy making, a legislative process, and then we have the informal track with all the kind of public sphere, civil society, and that's very important. But I saw a tendency that something like this in global governance, since we don't have that, the formal one, let's go for this, and let's this track compensate for all the lack of formal and legislative. So I think one underestimated the role of law, for instance, in this. So my reaction, it's a criticism of throwing in civil society wherever we lack something better and then think we get more democracy. So that was a tendency that was going on when deliberative democracy took a civil society turn in the 90s, I think. Because first we had the deliberative democracy turn, which was kind of good, I think, more fleshing out liberal democracy in a more substantial way. But then in a global context, we turned towards a civil society view more and more. And deliberative politics without institutions in a way, or without law. And I think so I'm a bit conservative in that. I wanted to emphasize the importance of law if we're going to have a global democracy or a global democratic multi-layered order of some kind. Yeah, I think.
Right, because that brings me to my next question about, civil society with necessarily bounded structures or formal structures raises itself, I suppose, questions of legitimacy, right? The legitimacy of civil society actors themselves. So to what extent are they representative? To what extent are they accountable? In whose name do they really speak? What do you think about that kind of critical approach and people saying, okay, well, who do civil society actors really represent? Do you think that's a valid critique? Do you think there's something there that civil society actors could perhaps more engage in terms of self-reflection, self-criticism there?
Yeah, on the one hand, those who think that civil society can play this non-representative and non-electoral role, they also put quite high demands on what civil society actors have to fulfill. Like they have to be internally transparent and they have to be accountable and so on. They put a lot of criteria on that to fulfill. But I think this is the wrong way to go, because I think they can be non-accountable if they want to, because I don't see them as having a role in the formalized decision making. I think this is the wrong way to go. So once we let go of that ambition and instead say that, well, they can't be representatives in what we mean in a democratic sense. So it's better that they just speak about shared interests of marginalized groups, not making a claim that they represent these people, but much more throwing in what are the fundamental problems in society. That's why I'm talking in the paper about them being very important in the problem identification phase of the political process and agenda setting. And I think that there they can play the role, but I don't think that they will have to fulfill certain criteria, because they are just citizens going together, organizing together. But it's the normative entity of democratic importance are the citizens themselves. So whether they do that through voice, through NGOs, or through unions, I think that's an open question. I don't mind them having that through civil society. I think the opposite. I think that's where the strength of civil society lies. And this is what I talk about a little bit in this paper, a bit Habermasian, that I think that the kind of what civil society can do is to bring out in the private sphere, in the life world, people's problems and bring them up on the tables and transform them into political issues to be picked up by the legislative process. But that's as far as I would go in talking about them representing anything.
Yeah. So the idea there then is that civil society, so the optimal role for civil society actors in the broader context of legitimacy of global governance is something like putting things on the agenda, attracting attention to problems, which is then picked up by more formal processes and institutions who then deal with whether it be climate change, whether it be human trafficking, whatever it is. So it's really a catalyst then, that civil societies play the role of a catalyst in identifying problems and pushing a particular agenda.
Not only what they empirically do best, but I think it's also normatively that's an attractive role that they could play. And then the other role that I talk about is post-decision functions, some forms of monitoring, evaluation. But then again, I put some normative demands on them. They have to be delegated power from an authorized source. So they can't just be self-proclaimed implementers of some policy. I think that is also going the wrong way, if one connects political legitimacy to democracy, as I do. If one sees no problem with doing that, of course, we can call a lot of things legitimacy. This is a problem with political legitimacy. It's that it's a normative notion that is applicable to so many things. We can talk about legitimate firms, and we don't mean democratic at all. But from my background, I think it's important to keep the normative, the democratic source. I mean, the rule by the people, like an ideal of self-governance in a way.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you the question we've been asking all of our speakers. We're sitting in Brexit Britain. You know, we have this wave of populism which has taken over, or at least has been prominent in domestic politics over the last couple of years. And one of the easy targets or soft targets of this populism has been global governance institutions because of the distance, because of lots of issues that come out with global governance that populists seem to quite easily latch on to. How do you see global governance evolving in the light of this kind of populist wave? Do you think this is maybe healthy? Maybe is this something that maybe global governance hasn't been brought to the attention of voters, that it's useful, at least in that respect? Do you think it's harmful? I mean, what are you optimistic about the future of global governance in the light of recent kind of populist attacks? Or
this is very tricky questions, and I think that this again, we have to both keep our long-distance goals and not let them go because of this kind of depressive times for global democracy, at least, or for democracy at all, I would say, at least in the West. I think it's important. Maybe we should be more ideal, theoretical thinking now, because I think still this could be a phase. And we also know that in critical times and populist times, new ideas are born. And so hopefully something could emerge out of this. But then, of course, the UK and the US in the Western sphere have always been, it's not a new thing that you do things a bit in your own way. So I think that has just intensified with Trump and with the Brexit, but it still has been a red thread, I mean, through EU history and in the US. Well, we had Obama for a while, but that's not the typical case anyway, even if Trump can't be compared to any other president when it comes to being skeptical of global cooperation overall.
Yeah, because that's one of the things. It's not, so, Euroscepticism in the UK has been around for a while, and America, as, the world's only hyperpower, as they call it, has been perhaps a little more detached from global governance.
Yeah.
But there is a sense in which it's a dismantling almost. It's not only being detached anymore. It's trying to undermine the international rules-based order, right? And this seems to be something new. I mean, how long it lasts, we don't know, of course. But I think, in some senses, there is a sense which you kind of alluded to, that crisis can be a catalyst for change, maybe for the better. And in some senses, trying to be optimistic or idealistic at it, maybe this is a moment of democratic renewal in international and global governance, that people know a lot more about what's going on, certainly in the UK with regard to the EU. And this, in it by itself, can't be a bad thing from a democratic perspective, right? Yeah. And that maybe there's a sense in which this might be a catalyst for some renewal. Yeah. Do you think that that's too optimistic a line?
Some days, I think that's how I think. It depends. But also with these populist parties in almost all countries in Europe, it's depressive to think about. But I hope, I mean, when we look at the data, who is voting for these, I mean, it's a lot of men, and they're often over 30, I think. And so I can think more optimistically about our students or our younger generation that comes now, that for them it's very natural to talk about democracy as something desirable. I hope. But so I think that there will be important 20 years now when these younger people are getting into their more into society and having work and so on. So we will see. But it's interesting that it's a lot of men and a lot of men with unsecure employment conditions. So maybe this is very Swedish, but I think a social democratic state could at least help out with that. So we don't get so much exclusion from the labor market and so on. I mean, or at least compensation and some safety networks for that. I think that is basically, I think equality and social equality and economic equality is, even Rousseau thought this is kind of basic to get democracy going. Even though if Rousseau was not a Democrat, I think even for him, the will of the people, I mean, can't get going with too much inequality. And I think that's actually the essence. So if we go for something, it should be more social economic equality. And then a lot of things will follow from that, I think.
But do you think, so if populism is in part due to security, people feeling insecure in their working conditions or in their lives or in their life choices, are you not then, so what do you think about enhancing security through enhanced democratic control of, say, the European Union or other global governance organizations? I mean, in some senses, one answer would be, let's bring it back to the state again. Let's put the state in the driving seat and the citizens control the state, so that creates it. But an alternative would be to say, look, to an extent you get better control, more security at least over the decisions if you enhance the democratic quality of these organizations, the WTO, whatever it might be.
I think that, I mean, it's also important that why we started talking about global democracy in the first place. I mean, in David Helt's book in the 90s, when I was a student in the beginning of the 90s, I read the title Global Democracy or something, or Models of Global Democracy. It was like, wow, what an ideal theoretical guy. And now everybody talks about it. So things happen also in that respect, that people can imagine this. But I think an important thing to remember is also that we started talking about that because we had problems that can't be solved democratically within a state. So we have at least theoretically, we've been thinking about a symmetry between the people, the rule makers and the rule takers. But since we know that problems are transgressing those boundaries, we're more and more all agree that some questions cannot be democratically solved using this model, and the nation state has been fitting for that symmetrical model. We want to expand the box, so to speak, to regain some symmetry on the global level concerning climate and future generations and things like that. But that doesn't mean that some of the decision making is best done on the nation state level. So I think So in that respect, it depends on the questions, I think. Yeah. Some should be globalized and some should not be globalized. I think it's also important for people to feel that their voice matter, and the closer they are to the questions, that will matter more. But some question we know that we have to share. It doesn't matter if we do the right, have the right climate policies in Sweden and the Norwegians don't. It's like a bad deal. So I think people are aware of these things now, actually. So we have to work on different levels at the same time.
Professor Erman, thank you very much for joining us today.